My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, I'm going to start a series on Sima Qian, something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Rob and I did a podcast on Sima Qian, his passage on Xiangyu, the man who almost founded China's first real dynasty. Before coming to a very bloody end, he cut off his own head and gave it to the person who was a friend of his as a reward. And we did that episode on March 7th, 2017. We also did a passage on Nie Zheng on May 28th, 2021, an assassin and a figure who, I don't want to say he was like a kung fu master, but he was one of the precedents of much of what kung fu would do. I felt like I needed to do more on Sima Qian just because he's such a towering figure in Chinese literature and Chinese history, but also because I'm working on some projects related to him and teaching him in my classes, so it makes it easy to do a podcast on him. For this series, I'm just going to do a grab bag of different things just to give you, the listener, a feel for what Sima Qian is really like. This is my attempt to right the wrong of not doing enough Sima Qian so far on the Chinese Literature Podcast to give Sima Qian the attention that he deserves. Today, I'm just going to give you some of the context of Sima Qian. Who was he? Why was he important? And in future podcasts in this series, I'm going to look at specific passages that Sima Qian wrote. So, who is Sima Qian? Sima Qian is the first big historian in Chinese history. Others had kind of written histories before Sima Qian. Most famously, you can argue that the Zuozhuan is China's first work of narrative history. But then you always have to add an asterisk when you say that. The Zuozhuan is not really a work of history that stands on its own. Rather, it's a commentary on the spring and autumn annals. Annals, for those of y'all who don't know, those are just year-by-year records of stuff that happened. So in medieval England, we have annals. It's just year-by-year record. This thing happened this year. This thing happened this year. In China, you have the same thing. Annals start out as very, very basic without any flourish. So it would look something like this. I'm just making this up. This is a hypothetical Chinese annal. Year 10 of King Jiawen's reign, there was a flood and a drought. Year 11 of King Jiawen's reign, there was a good harvest. Year 12 of King Jiawen's reign, there was a flood. This is just an example. I'm completely pulling this out of my patooey, but you get the idea. What the Zuozhuan is commentary on those annals. So the Zuozhuan took those annals, which exist independently as a separate document, and somehow it incorporated those. So to take that made-up example that I have, the Zuozhuan would have the annals. So year 10 of King Jiawen's reign, there is a flood and a drought. That's the annals. Then you have the commentary coming from the Zuozhuan. What actually happened was that there was a flood because King Jiawen had waged a battle against the barbarians to the east, and he had not made the proper sacrifices, and he had urinated on the gate, and so heaven cursed him with a flood and a drought, and the people suffered. I'm just completely making this up, but you get the idea. The Zuozhuan fleshes out what happens in the annals. Now, there's a debate going on right now as to whether or not the Zuozhuan was written as an independent history and then later collated around the annals, the spring and autumn annals. I don't have any insight into that. Whether or not the Zuozhuan was originally a commentary on the spring and autumn annals, or whether or not it was an independent text that was collated, it's really hard to talk about it as a full-on history with a capital H. The Zuozhuan it tells us a lot of important things that happened purportedly during the period that the Zuozhuan is writing about, the period from 722 BC to 468 BC. But the text is kind of scattershot. It covers all the stuff from the annals, and the commentary is written in a narrative form that sort of tells stories, but those stories are elaborating on the very basic information in the annals. All that's to say, it's hard to call the Zuozhuan the first Chinese history ever. Not only is it problematic to call the Zuozhuan a history, maybe you can argue it is a history, maybe you can argue it's not a history, but definitely you can't argue that the Zuozhuan's author is a historian because we just don't know who authored the Zuozhuan. The Zuozhuan literally means something like the tradition of Zuo. There's another title to this work. It's sometimes called the Zuo Shi Zhuan. That literally means the tradition of the Zuo family. So we have a name of an author for the Zuozhuan, Zuo Qiuming, supposedly a blind disciple of Confucius. But already, if you know anything about Homer, you're already questioning, is this dude a real dude? We have no idea if there was a real dude named Zuo Qiuming. In fact, there probably wasn't a guy named Zuo Qiuming, which makes sense because the other title for this work is the tradition of the Zuo family. All of this is just a way of saying, I don't know if we can call the Zuozhuan China's first historical work, and I definitely know we cannot say that Zuo Qiuming is China's first historian because we don't really think he existed. So, Sima Qian most definitely is a real person. He most definitely existed. We're fairly certain of that, though there are some question marks about his life. We'll talk about those question marks in later episodes. What do we know about Sima Qian? Sima Qian, we know, is born in 145 BC. That's 45 years before Julius Caesar is born, just to give you an idea of what time period we're talking about. We don't actually know when Sima Qian died. We know that he died after 91 BC, but he might have died as late as 87 or 86 BC. It's just really not clear. Sima Qian is born in a city that is today called Hancheng, but back then it was called Longmen. The city sits right there along the Yellow River at a point where there's a special river feature. Longmen literally means Dragon's Gate. The Dragon's Gate has an interesting history. The mythical Chinese emperor who supposedly was a cripple, but who supposedly also limped his way across China, linking the 9 different provinces together to form China. His name is Yu. Sometimes he's called the Great Yu, Da Yu. He supposedly built a tunnel there at Dragon's Gate. So I believe it still exists. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly in Sima Qian's time, there was this archaeological feature that existed. And supposedly it came from this mythical imperial figure. Yu the Cripple, he's one of the earliest political leaders in Chinese mythology. Like I said, they call him Yu the Great, Da Yu. You can imagine being born in this town. It gives Sima Qian the sense of history, of being in a place where the ancients had done great things. The city itself is about 150 miles northeast of modern-day Xi'an in Shanxi province, which of course, Xi'an is the site, approximately, of the Han Dynasty imperial capital. When Sima Qian was born, the Han Dynasty, China's first real dynasty. Now, you can say Qin Shi Huang founded a dynasty, the Qin dynasty, but it really didn't outlast him, so it's hardly a dynasty. There were other dynasties before that, the Zhou dynasty, the Shang dynasty, maybe the Xia dynasty existed, who knows. But the Zhou dynasty and the Shang dynasty weren't real dynasties in the sort of imperial Chinese sense. When we talk about dynasties, that's not what we're talking about. The Han dynasty from around 200 BCE to around 200 AD, though this is the first real imperial Chinese dynasty, and it set the pattern for everything that was to follow. Indeed, most Chinese folks, though not all, most Chinese folks today refer to the Chinese ethnic group that they are a part of as the Han, Hanzu. That gives you a sense of the path-setting nature of this dynasty, though the idea that they were all Han Chinese, that did not come about until about a millennium later. Sorry, I have to do the scholar thing, where I'm constantly footnoting myself as I talk. Sima Qian served under one of the most controversial emperors in Chinese history, Han Wudi, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty. Han is just, again, the title of the dynasty. Wu is his reign name. Di is his, it just means emperor. Even when talking about him in English with other scholars, we usually just say Han Wudi. It makes you sound like you know what you're talking about. Han Wudi is the emperor who Sima Qian is most connected with. He served directly under Han Wudi. Sima Qian's father is quite important in talking about Sima Qian. Sima Qian's dad is named Sima Tan. And I should mention here that most Chinese names are one character, and they come at the beginning of the name. For the Sima family, they're actually 2 characters. So Sima Tan, the surname of that family is Sima. The given name is Tan. Same for Sima Qian. Sima Tan is a court astrologer, a position that required doing a lot of recording down of events, of things that happen. At first, this position had very little to do with history. It was an astrology position. Because of the nature of astrology, it also kind of became an archivist position, keeping the imperial records. But slowly, under Sima Tan, and more so Sima Qian, the position becomes because of the work that they did, it became the court historian. Even today, when we use the word history in Chinese, it's 历史. That 史 is the position that Sima Qian and Sima Tan held, the astrologer. But it has come to mean history. It's come to refer to history just because of the work they did. Sima Tan starts this work where he's going to record the history of China from the earliest records to his present, but he dies before he can finish it. And actually, there's some questions as to how much of the work Sima Tan really did. We just don't know how much of the work the father did and how much of the work the son did. Sima Qian takes up this job of astrologer, archivist, and historian that his dad had. And he decides that he is going to make sure that the history that his dad started working on, this history of China from the beginning to the present, he wants that to get written. So Sima Qian writes this massive book. Really, I shouldn't say book. It's 130 chapters. The copy that I have stretches over 8 volumes. And in the past in China, these would have all been on lots and lots and lots of scrolls. The codex, what we often just call a book, but technically we should call it a codex, that thing you flip through with pages, that did not develop in China until much later. They had scroll. So Sima Qian writes this massive 130-chapter history of China. The book that he writes is called the Shi Ji, the Records of the Historian. Ji literally means records or recording. It could be a verb, it could be a noun. Shi is that position that I mentioned that Sima Qian inherited from his father. It starts out meaning astrologer, but after Sima Qian publishes his book, it comes to mean historian. Sima Qian starts at the very beginning. The early mythical emperors are documented in Sima Qian's work, and he talks a lot about the founding of the Han Dynasty, the destruction of the Qin Dynasty, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Most of the information that we have on these crucial events in early Chinese history, that all comes from Sima Qian. Recently, we've gotten some archaeological evidence, but Sima Qian is really the source on this. For example, there is a famous scene from the Qin Dynasty, Fen Shu Keng Ru. So it's referred to as the burning of the books and the burying of the Ru scholars. This supposedly occurs in 213 BC. 460 Confucian, that is Ru scholars, were buried, and much of the books from the previous 100, 200, 300 years, where you had competing schools of thought called the 100 Schools of Thought, those books were destroyed, the Confucian scholars were buried and killed. This all comes almost entirely from Sima Qian. We have no evidence of this event in any other history, and in fact, a lot of modern scholars, both in China and outside of China, doubt that this actually happened, or at least they don't think that it happened in the way that Sima Qian related. But if you were to tell a Chinese person, Fen Shu Keng Ru, they would immediately understand the reference. It's become so baked into Chinese historiographical thinking, that is, the thinking about history, that it really doesn't matter whether or not it happened. Everybody today knows about it and they reference it. Rob and I did a podcast on Zhang Jie's Book Burning Pit, a poem that was in May 2021 placed on a Chinese social media site by the owner of Meituan Dianping, who was critiquing Xi Jinping. He just placed the poem on this social media site and made some elliptical reference. This cost the company $26 billion. We called this the $26 billion poem. Chinese folks refer to things in Sima Qian. They know him very well. Whether or not this event actually occurred, he is incredibly important to understanding Chinese history just because of how baked into Chinese thinking he is. Chinese folks read him extensively, and his works are something that they're constantly referencing when they think about him, whether or not they realize that they are. But Sima Qian does not just write about emperors and Confucians getting buried. He also writes about a ton of small things. He writes about poets, he writes about assassins, he writes about kung fu masters. We can see the earliest shoots of kung fu literature coming out of Sima Qian. He writes about capitalists moving goods from one part of the empire to other parts of the empire and them developing high-tech industries like the iron industry. But he also writes about inanimate objects. He writes about the Fengshan sacrifice, an important imperial sacrifice that becomes this sign in imperial Chinese history that you are the baddest of the bad mamma jammas, that you are the emperor that has the heavenly mandate. As I wrap this discussion up, one thing I want to mention, so this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. If you want to go to Chinese history, that's Laszlo Montgomery. So why am I talking about Sima Qian if he's a historian? He's writing something that can be considered both history and literature. As I mentioned with the burning of the books and the burying of the Confucian scholars, we don't know whether or not what he is writing is completely made up, whether or not there's a kernel of truth to it. We just don't know. But a broader question that we get into in Chinese departments is there really any distinction between literature and history for early Chinese authors? Probably not. When Sima Qian is writing, that distinction is not really operative. He and most other Chinese folks at the time don't put things into the box of, this is history and that is literature and never the twain shall meet. They would have said that Sima Qian is writing about things that happened in the past. But I think they would have also freely admitted that maybe some of the stuff that he wrote is not true in the empirical sense. The stories that he wrote are what Stephen Colbert would have at one point called truthiness. They feel true, whether or not they are true. They're morally true, even if they're not empirically true. If you were having a beer with Sima Qian, he would have been upfront about this. He is always writing with an ideological message. He always has this moral message in his writing. Before China's encounter with the West, there's something important that you need to know about Chinese historiography. Historiography, again, is just a fancy way of saying historians thinking about the process of making history and the nature of a particular historical tradition. So historiography in China has a moral component to it until really the last 4 or 5 decades. And even today, I would still say that Chinese history, when you read it, you oftentimes have to be aware that the writer may have an agenda. They may not actually be talking about history in the past. They may actually just be picking and choosing details that support their views of present Chinese policies. History, in that traditional Chinese sense, always had to deliver a message about who was right and who was wrong. This is very common in China. The point of history was that it was supposed to be a moral lesson, teaching you who did right and who did wrong. Chinese history is very judgmental, and that's a feature, not a bug. Sima Qian is partially responsible for this. At the end of a lot of what he writes, he'll end it with a statement of moral judgment. At the end of a lot of these chapters, they'll have something that says, 太史公曰, or the great historian says, and then he will cast his moral judgment on a particular figure in Chinese history. Now, to some of my Western listeners, this may sound a bit strange at first. History is supposed to be about true things that happened in the past, full stop. History is not supposed to be about moral judgment. Well, that's not really true. That sense that historians should only write about true things, things that actually empirically happened, and completely disregard moral judgments, that really only starts in the West, probably about 400 or 500 years ago. When you read Roman historians like Plutarch, everything they do is about making this ideological or pedagogical purpose clear. They write history in order to teach the reader who is good and who is bad. This emphasis on empirical truth is not so much about China versus the West, it's more about modern versus traditional in terms of methodology. Today's Chengyu I've already mentioned on the podcast. It's 焚书坑儒, the burning of the books and the burying of the Confucian scholars, the Ru. As mentioned with the Zhangjie poem that was referenced by the head of Meituan Dianping, this oftentimes is something that Chinese people use to refer to a particularly totalitarian or authoritarian or just bad ruler. If you liked or if you hated the podcast, please send me an email. My email is ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. I'm sometimes excruciatingly slow to get back to you, but I do love emails and I do try and get back to everyone who emails me. If you want to show your love, please go to Patreon. Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.